The airport pulsed with noise and movement, an endless tide of rolling suitcases, shrieking children, weary travelers clinging to coffee cups as if salvation could be found at the bottom of a paper cup. Overhead, the loudspeakers crackled with boarding calls barely rising above the chatter. 1,000 lives in motion, none noticing the man standing just beyond the glass doors, motionless, yet carrying more weight than anyone could fathom. Colonel Jonathan Hayes adjusted his hat, the brass insignia catching a shaft of pale morning light. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked sharply against the tile floor as he stepped inside. To most, he was just another soldier in uniform, maybe returning home, heading out again. But today, his uniform was not just a formality. It was a flag of mourning, stitched with invisible threads of grief and honor. Outside, on the tarmac cloaked in mist, a casket lay waiting. Draped with the American flag, it seemed to pulse with a silent dignity all its own. Private Noah Mitchell. 21 years old. Gone before he had ever truly lived. Hayes felt the ache spread across his chest again, not from age, not from the miles he had marched in other lands, but from the sacred duty now resting squarely on his shoulders. No medals, no accolades could ever lighten that burden. He had made a promise once, long ago, to the brotherhood of soldiers: no one gets left behind. Not in battle, not in memory, not in the final crossing home. He walked toward the check-in counter, every step precise, deliberate. In his hand, he clutched a folder, his military orders, authorization papers, and the solemn declaration of his mission. It was supposed to be routine. In a just world, it would have been routine. But the world was rarely just. Behind the airline counter, a woman in a crisp uniform glanced up. Her eyes flickered across his ribbons and medals, lingering a second too long before she plastered on a brittle corporate smile. The kind of smile reserved for complaints about missing luggage or overbooked flights, not for the dead coming home. "Good morning, sir," she said, the words practiced, hollow. "May I see your ticket and identification?" Hayes slid the folder across the counter without a word. She opened it, scanned the documents, her fingers pausing mid-page. The flicker of uncertainty was quick, barely noticeable to an untrained eye. But Hayes had spent a lifetime reading hesitation, reading fear, reading all the things people tried to hide. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She typed something into the computer. Paused. Typed again. Hayes waited, unmoving. Outside, the sun struggled to break through the clouds. Finally, she looked up, her voice a half-octave higher than before. "Sir. I'm sorry, but it appears there's an issue with your ticket. You'll need to step aside, please." A beat of silence stretched between them. Thick. Heavy. Hayes' jaw tightened. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," he said, voice low but steady. "These papers are in order. Check again." The woman hesitated. Another agent behind her leaned over, peering at the screen, whispering something Hayes couldn't hear. Their eyes darted toward him, then away. As if he were something inconvenient, something to be shuffled quietly out of sight. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere, a boarding call echoed. Here, between the polished tiles and the fluorescent lights, something far uglier began to take shape, a crack in the polished facade of duty, respect, and decency. Hayes knew it instinctively, the way a soldier senses an ambush before the first shot is fired. This wasn't about paperwork. This wasn't about security. This was about something much older, much deeper, a judgment made not on what he carried, but on what he was. He straightened his spine, shoulders square against the gathering storm. He wasn't here for himself. He was here for Noah Mitchell. And he was not leaving without him. The woman behind the counter averted her gaze, tapping frantically at her keyboard. The line of passengers grew restless behind him, their irritation buzzing like a low hive. A businessman checked his watch. A woman sighed loudly. No one knew yet that history was about to hinge on this ordinary morning at Gate 17. Hayes remained still. The silence between him and the airline staff thickened. The first quiet fracture of dignity had been made. But Hayes would not let it become a landslide. Not today. Not for Noah. Not while he still had breath in his body. The agent returned to the counter, a second employee trailing her. Both wore matching expressions, tight smiles stretched too thin over growing discomfort. "I'm sorry, sir," the first woman said again, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "There's been a policy update. Military escorts must undergo additional screening. Unfortunately, we can't process you at this counter." Policy update. The words dropped between them like a stone into a deep, black well. Colonel Hayes barely blinked. He had heard 1,000 variations of the same excuse in his lifetime, spoken in different languages, dressed in different uniforms, wrapped in different legalese, but always carrying the same underlying message: you are not welcome here. He inhaled through his nose, slow and steady. "I am not a civilian passenger," he said, voice measured, almost dangerously calm. "I am on official orders. My mission is to escort Private First Class Noah Mitchell home. To his family." The younger agent shifted uncomfortably, glancing over her shoulder. Whispers passed like invisible currents among the staff behind the counter. None of them looked directly at Hayes. They stared at their keyboards, their phones, anywhere but him. A man in a business suit behind Hayes cleared his throat loudly. Another traveler muttered under their breath. The line behind him thickened, but the space around him grew strangely hollow, like standing at the eye of a storm before it breaks. "Sir, please understand," the second agent said, "this isn't about you. It's just protocol. Protocol. Another shield to hide behind. Another way to say, stay in your place." Hayes tightened his grip on the folder in his hand until the corners bent under the pressure. He had fought for this country. He had led men into places so dangerous that even angels held their breath. He had seen the best and worst of humanity under the harshest suns. And yet here, on home soil, in a place built on freedom and sacrifice, he stood being questioned like a trespasser. A low voice from somewhere back in the line pierced the growing tension. "Hey," it said. "What's going on?" Heads began to turn. Murmurs stirred like the first tremor before an earthquake. The woman at the counter pressed a button under the desk, subtle, but Hayes caught the motion. A call for a supervisor. Reinforcements. As if he were a threat to be managed, not a man fulfilling the most sacred of duties. Hayes said nothing. He simply stood there, tall and unyielding. Every line of his body spoke one truth: I will not be moved. It wasn't the first time a uniform like his had been seen and disregarded. And it wouldn't be the last. But today, there would be witnesses. At first, it was just a hum. A few low voices, a few furrowed brows. But like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spread. A teenage boy, backpack slung over one shoulder, leaned into his mother, whispering urgently. A businessman loosened his tie, craning his neck for a better view. An elderly woman clutched her boarding pass a little tighter, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. He's in uniform, someone said, louder this time. Why aren't they letting him through? Another voice, sharper, cut through the growing buzz. Is this how we treat our soldiers now? The airline staff behind the counter stiffened, sensing the shift in the air. The supervisor, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a clipboard tucked under his arm, finally emerged from the back office, summoned by the silent alarm bell of public attention. He approached with forced briskness, pasting a professional smile onto his face like armor. Colonel Hayes, he said, glancing briefly at the name on Hayes's orders. I'm sorry for the confusion. There's been a security protocol adjustment this morning. Nothing personal, sir. Hayes stared at him, eyes steady and unblinking. The words tasted metallic in the air. Defined adjustment, Hayes said evenly. The supervisor shifted his weight from foot to foot. His gaze flicked over the line of passengers, now openly watching, some with their phones out, recording, documenting, waiting. It's a random screening procedure, the supervisor said at last. You'll need to wait while we verify some details. Random. Protocol. Adjustment. Always the same dance. Always the same thinly veiled lie. A tall man in a faded veteran's cap stepped out of the line, his face weathered and lined with experience. Random, huh? He said, voice rough and unimpressed. Funny how it's always random when someone like him is involved. The crowd murmured in agreement. A woman near the back raised her phone higher, her finger already swiping up to start a live stream. Hayes could feel it building, the swell of public conscience rising like a tide that would not be turned back. But still, he said nothing. He let the silence stretch, heavy and condemning, until even the supervisor began to fidget. Across the terminal, the announcement speakers crackled half-heartedly, calling flights that no one was listening to. All eyes were on the man in the uniform, the man the airline had tried to shrink down to an inconvenience, a problem, a file to be adjusted. They had forgotten something fundamental, something woven into every thread of that uniform. You do not shrink a soldier. You do not bury honor under paperwork. And when the people see, when they truly see it, they do not stay silent. A woman near the front stepped forward, her voice clear. Let him through. Simple. Uncompromising. A demand, not a request. Another voice echoed her. He's carrying someone's son home. Show some respect. The agent behind the counter flinched. The supervisor paled slightly. And in Colonel Hayes's chest, something fierce and bright and unbreakable began to rise. The tide had turned. This was no longer a quiet injustice. It was a public reckoning. It started with one woman stepping forward. Then another. And another. Colonel Hayes stood rooted to the spot, the steady weight of Private Carter's orders tucked in his breast pocket like a silent vow. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't raised his voice. But something deeper than anger was moving through the terminal now, something older, something righteous. A young man in a hoodie lowered his phone, stepping out of the line. This man's doing his duty. We're not moving until you do right by him. His voice, though quiet, cut through the tension like a blade. Others murmured their agreement, a low rumble of solidarity that grew with every passing second. Across the marble floors of the terminal, the ripple of defiance was spreading. Not violent. Not chaotic. But firm. Undeniable. The supervisor's polished words were crumbling. The airline's practiced professionalism was slipping. The woman in the denim jacket, who had been silently watching, marched forward now, her chin set in a determined line. You treat him like this, you treat all of us like this. Behind her, the Marine veteran crossed his arms and planted his boots wide, a silent mountain of support. The supervisor tried to recover, hands raised in a gesture of false calm. Please, everyone, we just need a moment to sort this out. No, said the woman in the denim jacket sharply. Sort it out now. More phones were raised. More passengers stepped forward. No longer passengers. No longer bystanders. They were witnesses. They were allies. The atmosphere shifted further, crackling with electricity. It wasn't a mob. It wasn't rage. It was something far more dangerous than injustice. It was the collective conscience. Colonel Hayes met the supervisor's eyes, calm and unmovable. You don't just answer to me anymore, Hayes said quietly. You answer to all of them. The supervisor's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked left, looked right, as if searching for an exit, a loophole, a way out of the storm he had unleashed. But there was none. Not anymore. In that moment, the truth was clear to everyone. This wasn't about airline policy. It wasn't about paperwork. It was about dignity. About respect. About honoring a promise made on fields soaked in blood and sacrifice. And today, in this ordinary airport, surrounded by ordinary people, that promise would not be broken. Not on their watch. Not on his. The whispers turned into firm declarations. Let him through. Honor the soldier. Respect the uniform. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The quiet strength of it was far louder than any roar. Colonel Hayes stood taller, feeling the weight of history pressing close. Not just for Private Carter. Not just for himself. But for every soldier who had ever been forgotten. For every silent injustice that had ever been allowed to stand, because too many had looked away. Not today. Today, they were all standing. The terminal air had shifted, no longer sterile, complacent. It was thick with a new weight, the kind that turned passive travelers into a collective force, the kind that cracked polished surfaces with nothing but the pressure of truth. Behind the counter, the agent who had first denied Colonel Hayes shrank into herself, her fingertips hovering uselessly above the keyboard, as if typing could somehow undo what had already been witnessed. The supervisor, pale and sweating now, clicked the pen compulsively in his fingers, a meaningless sound swallowed by the heavy silence. The crowd was still, unmoving, but their presence was thunderous, an invisible storm gathering strength. Colonel Hayes remained rooted in place. He had made no demands. He had raised no banners. But he had stood. And sometimes, that was all it took to make the world tilt. Finally, a second man appeared, a man in a slick, navy suit whose polished shoes barely made a sound against the tile. His badge gleamed under the harsh airport lights, regional director. A fixer. A man sent when problems could no longer be swept away. He approached briskly, carrying the brittle smile of someone trained to extinguish fires without getting burned. But even he could feel it, the dangerous awareness of the crowd, the way every phone was poised like a silent witness. He cleared his throat, voice professionally smooth. Colonel Hayes, sir, I sincerely apologize for the confusion. We have resolved the issue. We would be honored to personally escort you to your flight. He gestured grandly, as if offering a favor, not repairing a wound. Hayes didn't move. He didn't even blink. He could hear the layers beneath the words. He knew the language of power when it spoke in the thin veneer of diplomacy. This wasn't an apology. It was a negotiation. It was survival. Hayes adjusted his uniform slowly, letting the silence stretch until even the suited man began to shift uneasily. I see, Hayes said finally, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. And if no one had been recording, he asked, tilting his head ever so slightly, gaze steady as stone. The question hung there, naked and brutal. The crowd inhaled as one. The suited man's smile faltered. If no one had seen, Hayes continued, voice gaining the subtle gravity of a rising tide, would I still be standing here, denied the right to bring one of our own home? There was no answer. Only the small, choking sound of someone swallowing shame. In the corner of his eye, Hayes saw the Marine nod once, sharp, approving. The woman in the denim jacket wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, almost angrily, as if furious that such a question had even needed to be asked. The man in the hoodie muttered under his breath, tell them, sir. Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth, when spoken simply, had its volume. The regional director adjusted his tie, looking like a man who had realized he had walked into a battlefield with only paper shields. We regret deeply the oversight, he said at last, the words hollow against the raw, exposed nerves of the crowd. Oversight. Hayes almost laughed. But there was no humor left for this place. He simply nodded once. "Get me to Private Carter," he said. Nothing more. Nothing less. Because that was the mission. It had always been the mission. Not ego. Not victory. Duty. And that, no policy or power structure could ever deny. The regional director stepped aside, motioning frantically to a pair of younger agents to clear a path. Colonel Hayes squared his shoulders and walked forward. Not because they had allowed him to, but because he had never needed their permission. Colonel Hayes moved through the terminal with the slow, deliberate pace of a man carrying more than just orders. Each step was a statement. Each click of his polished boots against the sterile tile echoed louder than the overhead announcements, louder than the frantic whispers trailing in his wake. Behind him, the suited director hurried to keep up, flanked by nervous airline staff who now looked everywhere but at the crowd they had once dismissed as mere passengers. But the crowd was no longer passive. It had become something else. Something dangerous. The Marine stepped forward first, falling into an easy stride just behind Hayes, like a silent honor guard. Others followed, a ripple of movement, men and women, old and young, some still clutching boarding passes, some cradling coffee cups, all shedding their roles as travelers to become witnesses. Not in anger. In solidarity. Phones were still raised, but they were no longer recording from a distance. They moved with him now, like silent spotlights, broadcasting not just his journey but their silent refusal to look away. A woman with a toddler balanced on one hip turned to her husband, voice raw with emotion. "He's not alone." A teenager in a varsity jacket whispered to his friend. "They're afraid now." Hayes kept his eyes forward, face carved from granite, but inside, something fragile stirred, a deep, buried place where dignity had been beaten and bruised too often to hope. But hope was stirring anyway. They reached the gate. A sleek black car was waiting on the tarmac outside, engine idling, a uniformed driver standing stiffly by the door. The suited director motioned hurriedly toward it. "Your transport is ready, Colonel. Again, we apologize." Hayes raised one hand, cutting him off with nothing more than a slight motion. No more apologies. No more empty words. The crowd pressed closer now, not to intrude, but to bear witness to this moment. To make sure it mattered. Hayes paused at the gate, turned slowly, and faced them. Not the airline. Not the bureaucracy. Them. The people who had seen and refused to stay blind. The Marine offered a sharp, respectful nod, the kind soldiers reserved for moments that mattered more than orders. The young woman in the denim jacket wiped her eyes but didn't look away. The teenager with the varsity jacket squared his shoulders, as if somehow lending his strength. Hayes allowed himself a breath, a real breath, for the first time that day. He adjusted his uniform with a slow, steady hand, the gesture crisp, dignified. Then he spoke. Not loudly. But enough that no one missed a word. "Thank you," he said simply. Not just to the Marine. Not just to the few who had raised their voices. To all of them. For standing. For remembering. For proving that silence, too, could be a weapon, one either wielded by injustice, or broken by courage. Hayes turned, stepping through the open gate toward the waiting car, the casket of Private First Class Nathan Carter visible now under its flag, glinting under the late afternoon sun. And as he walked, the crowd stood motionless, heads bowed slightly, not because someone told them to, but because something inside them demanded it. A reverence not taught, but instinctive. Honor. Dignity. Respect. The things that should never have needed a viral video to be recognized. The car door closed softly behind Hayes. The engine purred. And as the vehicle pulled away, the phones lowered. The whispers faded. But the memory of that walk, that silent procession of one man carrying the weight of duty, and an entire crowd carrying the weight of conscience, would remain. Long after the tweet stopped trending. long after the outrage had cooled. Some truths once seen could never be unseen again. And sometimes, it only took one man refusing to step aside to show a nation how far it still had to walk. The wheels of the black car hadn't even left the tarmac when the firestorm ignited. What had started as murmurs, passing glances, and whispers of indignation now surged into something unstoppable. In living rooms, in coffee shops, on crowded subway cars, screens lit up with the story of Colonel Elijah Hayes, the soldier who had been refused dignity while carrying a fallen brother home. The first headlines came from local stations, small blurbs flashing. Army colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier, witnesses outraged. Then the national media caught the scent. Within hours, it was everywhere. Photos and shaky videos filled every feed. The towering figure of Hayes in uniform, standing at the counter. The silent, unmoving crowd behind him. The shame frozen on the faces of airline staff. It wasn't just news. It was a reckoning. Hashtags blazed across Twitter, bold and furious. Honor our heroes. Let him fly. Respect the fallen. Veterans organizations released furious statements. Gold Star families, those who had lost loved ones in service, penned open letters. Celebrities retweeted the story with captions that burned with outrage. Politicians scrambled to issue comments, some out of genuine anger, others out of calculated survival. But beyond all the noise, beyond the whirlwind of talking heads and televised outrage, something deeper was happening. A shift. At airports across the country, people stopped and looked longer at the uniformed service members they once barely noticed. They approached quietly, offering handshakes, murmured thanks, and standing up in silent tribute when soldiers boarded flights. Security agents, clerks, and airline managers, all suddenly remembered the meaning of respect. It wasn't legislation. It wasn't a policy memo. It was 1,000 small acts, multiplied across a nation. It was a question asked in unspoken ways. If I had been there, would I have stood up too? The airline that had sparked it all wasn't spared. Within a week, their CEO appeared on national television, sweat beading at his temple under the hot studio lights. "We deeply regret the incident involving Colonel Hayes," he read stiffly from a prepared statement. "It does not reflect the values of our organization." But the words rang hollow. Apologies that come only after exposure carry no weight. Their stock price tumbled. Veterans groups organized protests outside their offices. Public trust, once taken for granted, cracked and crumbled like dry earth in a long drought. They tried to offer scholarships. They tried to sponsor military charities. But the wound was too raw, the betrayal too fresh. The American public had already made up its mind. Respect wasn't a brand. It wasn't a PR campaign. It was something earned, moment by moment, decision by decision. And they had failed when it mattered most. Meanwhile, Colonel Hayes stayed silent. He refused interviews. Refused offers to appear on morning shows. Refused to let them turn grief into spectacle. Because it was never about him. It was about Private First Class Nathaniel Carter, a boy from a small town in Georgia who dreamed of being an engineer, who wrote letters home every week, who loved his mother's cornbread and hated broccoli. A boy who wore the same uniform Hayes wore now. Hayes had only one mission left. One promise to keep. And nothing, not bureaucracy, not prejudice, not even the weight of an entire country's shame, would stop him. The world raged around him. But inside, a singular, burning focus remained. Bring him home. Bring him home with honor. The town of Marlow had only one traffic light. One post office. One diner where the coffee was always lukewarm, but the smiles were genuine. It was the kind of place where kids grew up dreaming of bigger cities, brighter lights, and where families stayed rooted through generations like the old oaks lining Main Street. It was also where Nathaniel Carter had lived, and where he was coming home for the last time. Colonel Hayes sat in the back of the black hearse as it rolled slowly down Main Street, its windows open to the spring air. The casket, draped in the American flag, rested solemnly behind him. He wore his full dress uniform, medals gleaming sharply against the dark fabric. But his heart was heavy, weighed down not by the uniform but by the invisible burden of grief. As they passed the town's small businesses, the barber shop, the bakery, the hardware store, people stepped outside. Men removed their caps. Women pressed their hands to their hearts. Children held tiny flags that fluttered weakly in the soft wind. No one spoke. No one needed to. Their silence was a cathedral. Hayes kept his eyes forward, jaw set, but something inside him trembled. He had walked battlefields. He had stood beneath foreign suns, burying brothers in arms in strange lands. But nothing was harder than this. As the hearse turned onto Willow Lane, a figure appeared at the end of the road. A woman. Small. Worn. Standing utterly still. In her hands, she held a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind Nathaniel used to pick for her as a boy. Her face was lined not by age, but by a sorrow too vast for words. Nathaniel's mother. When the hearse came to a slow stop, Colonel Hayes opened the door and stepped out. The world around him blurred, the murmuring crowd, the whisper of flags, even the weight of the cameras still filming from a respectful distance. All he saw was her. He moved toward her with measured steps, the folded American flag cradled carefully in his arms. When he reached her, he dropped to one knee. The flag, a lifetime of service, a lifetime of dreams, rested in his outstretched hands. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed his, and in that brief contact, everything passed between them. The pride. The pain. The terrible, aching love. On behalf of a grateful nation, Hayes said, voice steady but hollow, we present to you the flag under which your son served and sacrificed. For a moment, she couldn't move. Tears filled her eyes, blurring the flag, blurring everything. Then, slowly, she gathered the folded triangle to her chest and closed her eyes. The wildflowers fell from her other hand, scattering like tiny stars across the gravel. Colonel Hayes remained kneeling, head bowed. Not because protocol demanded it. Not because of duty. But because in that moment, he understood. Some debts could never be repaid. Some losses could never be measured. Behind them, the town stood witness, heads bowed, silence as vast as the open sky. Hayes rose slowly, saluted sharply, and stepped back. He would not speak platitudes. He would not pretend that a folded flag could ever replace a son. He simply stood with her. In the raw, unvarnished truth of it all. Because sometimes, the greatest honor you can give the fallen is not words, but presence. Not promises, but remembrance. He had brought Nathaniel home. Not just to the earth, but to the arms that had first held him. And somehow, in that unbearable stillness, something like healing began. A small, fragile thing. But real. The funeral ended, but the story did not. Across America, the ripples kept spreading, far beyond the small town of Marlow, far beyond the quiet dignity of Colonel Hayes and Nathaniel's grieving mother. News anchors spoke his name. Talk shows debated it. The footage, the denial, the confrontation, the silence of a soldier refusing to bend, played over and over until it etched itself into the nation's conscience. It wasn't just another headline. It was a mirror. A mirror that reflected something raw and uncomfortable to everyone watching. And not everyone liked what they saw. The airline issued a formal statement, crisp and cold as an autumn wind. We apologize for the misunderstanding. We value and honor our service members. But words, once hollowed out by fear and exposure, could not mend what had been broken. A few executives resigned quietly, slipping away like shadows at sunset. A few middle managers found themselves reassigned. The CEO held a press conference, sweating under the relentless lights, mouthing phrases about reform and diversity training, and commitment to our values. But it was too late. The public had seen the truth. Not just the humiliation of one man, but the casual erosion of dignity that had allowed it. Veterans groups organized boycotts. Airline stocks tumbled, a slow, grinding descent fueled by outrage and conscience. For the first time in years, people stopped and asked themselves hard questions. How often had they looked away? How many silent moments of injustice had they let slip past, thinking, "It's not my fight"? And what if the one being denied tomorrow wasn't a stranger, but someone they loved? In Marlow, the town's one diner changed its menu board for a week. In bright chalk letters, it read, "Respect is not a privilege. It is a right. No fanfare. No speeches. Just truth, written in the hand of someone who understood that small gestures can cut deeper than grand apologies." And somewhere across the country, in airports where hurried travelers bustled toward their gates, there were quiet changes too. A soldier in uniform walked to a counter, and this time, the attendant rose to their feet. A veteran missing a limb struggled with a carry-on, and 3 people rushed to help without waiting to be asked. Tiny things. Barely noticeable. Except to those who had once carried burdens invisible to everyone else. Colonel Hayes did not seek interviews. He did not attend rallies. He returned to his duties, silent and steadfast, the way soldiers have always carried the burdens of others. But in quiet homes, in whispered prayers, in the ink of op-eds and the late-night conversations between fathers and sons, his name was remembered. Not because he demanded attention, but because he had stood, when it mattered most, without raising his voice, without raising a hand. Because sometimes, the loudest battles are fought in silence. And sometimes, the greatest victories are won not by conquering others, but by refusing to let injustice define who we are. Weeks passed. The country's attention, as it always did, shifted to new headlines, new scandals, new outrages, new distractions. But some things, once seen, could not be unseen. In the quiet of his modest home, Colonel Hayes continued his life with the same precision and humility that had shaped him for decades. He rose early. He polished his boots. He visited Nathaniel's mother every Sunday without fail, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes simply sitting on her front porch while she spoke to the wind, telling it stories about her boy. And when no one was watching, Hayes would stand alone in his kitchen, staring at the folded flag on his counter, the one he had presented to her with trembling hands, and feel the weight of a world that often failed its bravest children. Then, one rainy afternoon, a small, nondescript envelope arrived. No return address. Just his name, handwritten in a script so careful it felt almost reverent. Hayes opened it slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the paper might crumble in his calloused hands. Inside was a single sheet. No long speech. No grand apology. Just a short message, scrawled in firm, deliberate strokes. Because you stood firm, I stood up. Because you spoke with silence, I found my voice. Thank you for reminding us that dignity is not given, it is carried. I see now. We all see now. A stranger you gave courage. Hayes sat down heavily at his worn kitchen table. He read the note again. And again. The rain tapped softly against the windows, as if the world itself were leaning closer, listening. For the first time in a long time, the tight knot that had lived in Hayes's chest, the one built by years of endurance, quiet disappointments, invisible battles, began to loosen. He wasn't the kind of man who sought validation. But sometimes, when the world had seemed too heavy, too indifferent, he had wondered if it mattered. If the small stand of one man, against the machinery of injustice, could truly make a difference. Now he knew. It wasn't about changing the whole world at once. It was about igniting something small, fragile, but stubbornly alive. A spark in one person. Then another. And another. Until one day, without even realizing it, the darkness receded. Not because it had been vanquished by anger or force, but because it had been lit up, one trembling flame at a time, by ordinary people who refused to look away. Hayes folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside the worn leather wallet he carried everywhere, a private reminder, a secret vow renewed. Tomorrow he would wake up early. He would polish his boots. He would carry himself with the same unshakable dignity, not because the world rewarded it, but because it was right. Because some promises were bigger than applause. Because some battles were won simply by refusing to kneel. And because somewhere out there, unseen and unknown, someone was still watching, learning how to stand. Colonel Hayes had tucked the letter away and returned to his daily routines, but far beyond his quiet home, the ripples of that single moment in the airport continued to spread. They didn't roar like a tidal wave. They whispered. Soft, persistent. In places Hayes would never walk, among people he would never meet, the story took root like wildflowers in cracked sidewalks. In small towns and sprawling cities, veterans groups organized rallies, not angry protests, but solemn gatherings, candles flickering in the dusk, where people stood shoulder to shoulder, honoring not only Nathaniel but every forgotten soldier whose last journey deserved reverence. A mural was painted on a forgotten wall in Detroit. An American flag, a pair of worn boots, and beneath them, the simple words, "Respect is a duty, not a gift." In coffee shops, a stranger would pick up the check for a uniformed service member, leaving only a napkin with a handwritten note. Because you stand for us, we stand for you. At airports across the country, ordinary passengers began to pause, truly pause whenever a soldier boarded. No longer distracted, no longer looking away. Sometimes, they clapped. Sometimes, they simply stood in silence, heads bowed, in the purest gesture of respect. It wasn't organized. It wasn't announced. It was a quiet revolution. A reminder awakening in the collective heart of a weary nation. That honor was not a performance. It was a habit. A choice. A reflection of who they were, and who they aspired to be. Meanwhile, journalists dug deeper. Stories emerged. The airline's policy error was revealed to be something uglier. Risk assessment, practice quietly advising agents to scrutinize passengers based on subjective appearance metrics, a practice that had gone unnoticed for years because no one had dared to challenge it so publicly before. But now, under the scrutiny of millions, the system began to crumble. Executives issued apologies. Policies were rewritten. Mandatory training sessions on dignity, respect, and bias were launched across industries, not because a law demanded it, but because shame had. And all of it, every whispered conversation, every silent pledge to do better, had been sparked by a man who never raised his voice, who never demanded outrage, who simply stood his ground. Colonel Hayes, sitting in his small kitchen with a battered leather wallet and a folded flag, would never know the full extent of it. And that was exactly how he would have wanted it. Because it had never been about him. It had been about the boy in the flag-draped casket. About every boy and girl like him. About every unseen, uncelebrated act of service that deserves a nation's full, unflinching respect. The revolution had no banners. No slogans. Just a memory carried forward, in hearts, in habits, in silent decisions to look up, to stand up, to speak up. Whispers across the nation. And in the end, isn't that how the deepest change always begins? The sun was slipping beneath the horizon, bleeding gold and crimson across the open fields outside Colonel Hayes' window. He sat at the edge of his modest living room, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling in his hand, the television muted in front of him. News channels flashed his story in ticker tapes at the bottom of the screen, but Hayes wasn't looking at them. He was staring at the folded American flag resting carefully on the mantel. The flag was heavier than it looked. It always was. For hours after returning home, he hadn't moved much. Hadn't spoken. Inside him, two currents collided, pride and sorrow, hope and exhaustion. Part of him knew he had done right. He had stood firm without shouting, without rage. He had honored Private Samuel Brooks exactly as duty demanded, with dignity and unyielding resolve. And yet, there was a quiet ache that even discipline couldn't suppress. He wondered, why had it taken so much noise to defend something so simple? Why did a uniform have to come with a battle for basic respect? In that ache, Colonel Hayes saw not only the fallen soldier he had escorted home but all those who had been forgotten, dismissed, and disrespected. He thought of the countless quiet acts of sacrifice across the nation. The single mothers waiting alone at bases for letters that may never come. The veterans stand invisible on crowded streets. The old soldiers, their stories fading into dust because no one bothered to ask. A lump rose in Hayes' throat. He set the cup down carefully, afraid that even a slight tremor would betray what he felt inside. Outside, the evening deepened into night. The hum of crickets rose. A train wailed faintly somewhere beyond the hills. In the stillness, Hayes realized something. This wasn't just about one incident in one airport. It wasn't even about the boy in the casket. It was about a culture. A forgetting. A slow erosion of reverence, not from hatred, but from distraction. From comfort. From assuming that someone else would remember, so we didn't have to. Hayes sat there for a long time, the flag in his peripheral vision, feeling the heavy truth settle deep into his bones. Respect wasn't automatic. It wasn't inherited. It had to be fought for, daily, deliberately, in 1,000 small ways no one would ever see. Not with anger. But with insistence, standing still when it would be easier to move on. Speaking up when silence was more comfortable. Remembering that behind every uniform, every folded flag, there was a name, a family, a love story cut short. The weight of silence pressed down on Hayes' chest. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of crushing him, it made him stronger. It forged in him a steely, gentle resolve. If the world was going to forget, then he would not. Even if no one else was watching. Even if it never made the news again. Even if he stood alone. Hayes rose slowly from his chair. He walked to the mantel, picked up the folded flag, and held it against his chest with both hands. The fabric was cool against his skin, but the meaning of it burned like a fire inside him. He closed his eyes. And silently, without fanfare or witness, he made a vow. Never forget. Never let them be forgotten. The night deepened. But within Colonel Hayes, a new light had been kindled. Not the wild, consuming fire of anger. But the steady, enduring flame of honor. It would not go out. Not tonight. Not ever. Colonel Hayes didn't plan the movement that followed. He didn't seek it. He didn't even want it. All he had done was stand still, unwavering, dignified, when the moment demanded it. But sometimes, the smallest acts ripple far beyond their starting point. A week after the airport incident, Hayes received a letter. No envelope. Just a folded piece of paper, hand-delivered to his home by a local postal worker who simply said, "Thank you, sir," before walking away. Hayes opened it with cautious fingers. Inside, a child's handwriting sprawled across the page. Dear soldier. My daddy says you stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Michael, age 8. Hayes sat down heavily, the paper trembling in his hands. He hadn't realized how much he needed that. Not praise, not recognition, but proof that somewhere, somehow, the message had gotten through. The next day, a woman approached him while he was grocery shopping, tears brimming in her eyes. My brother, she whispered, never made it home. I saw what you did. Thank you, for reminding them. Soon after, invitations began arriving from schools, veterans groups, and small town halls. They didn't want a hero. They didn't want speeches. They wanted stories. They wanted reminders. They wanted someone to stand before them and say, "Respect is not a courtesy. It's a duty." Hayes didn't accept every invitation. He wasn't looking to become a symbol. But when he spoke, when he told the story of Private Samuel Brooks, and the forgotten promises stitched into every fold of every flag, he saw something remarkable. People listened. Not out of guilt. Not out of obligation. Out of something deeper. Recognition. They remembered their own uncles who had served, their grandmothers who had waited, their friends who had come home different, or hadn't come home at all. One evening, after speaking at a small rural church, an elderly man in a battered leather jacket came up to him, his hands trembling slightly. "Son," he said hoarsely, "I fought in Korea. And for a long time, I thought nobody cared anymore. But you. You reminded me they do." The man saluted. Hayes returned the salute with quiet reverence, blinking hard against the emotion rising in his throat. He realized something then, something that had been growing quietly inside him since the moment at the airport. When one voice stands up, it allows others to remember their strength. Respect wasn't just an individual act. It was a collective force. It could roll like thunder through forgotten places. It could heal. It could change things. And not just for soldiers. For every unseen soul. For every overlooked sacrifice. For every quiet life lived with honor. As Hayes left the church that night, the stars were beginning to pierce the velvet sky. He paused on the steps, breathing in the crisp air. Somewhere in the darkness, an American flag flapped gently against its pole. Hayes watched it for a long moment. He knew now. That respect wasn't a battle you won once. It was a torch you passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, generation to generation. And standing here, under the quiet stars, Hayes made another vow. He would never let the silence win again. Not as long as he drew breath. Not as long as memory endured. Not as long as there were still people willing to stand. Quietly, stubbornly, bravely. For the dignity that every soul deserves. It didn't take long for the nation to notice. The footage from the airport spread like wildfire. Not just in small corners of the internet, but across evening news broadcasts, front pages, and late-night talk shows. It wasn't the drama that caught people's attention. It wasn't even the confrontation. It was the stillness. The unshakable dignity of a single man standing silent against disrespect. And refusing to bow. Across America, conversations shifted. In coffee shops and church pews, at dinner tables and bus stops, people spoke not of scandal or outrage, but of something far rarer. Honor. Dignity. What it meant to owe someone more than a passing nod, to owe them real, living respect. Veterans who had long felt invisible found themselves embraced in grocery aisles, thanked in parking lots. Teachers paused their lessons to tell the story to their students, weaving it into history lessons about duty and sacrifice. Grandparents pulled out faded photographs and told stories their families had never heard, of friends lost, of promises made, of values once sacred but forgotten. And at the heart of it all, without trying, without asking, Colonel Elijah Hayes became something more than a soldier escorting a fallen comrade. He became a mirror. A mirror reflecting a simple, unshakable truth. We are measured by how we treat those who cannot speak for themselves. Major news networks requested interviews. Publishing houses sent offers for memoirs. Hayes declined them all. He didn't want a book deal. He didn't want a platform. He wanted the memory of Private Samuel Brooks honored, not commercialized. He wanted people to remember that soldiers did not fight for fanfare, they fought for quiet things. For peace. For dignity. For each other. He appeared only once, briefly, at a live memorial broadcast held at Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by rows of white headstones gleaming under a cloudless sky. He stood at the podium, not in dress blues, but in simple civilian clothes, holding nothing but a single folded flag against his chest. When he spoke, his voice was steady, clear. Respect is not a ceremony. It's not a hashtag. It's how we live when no one is watching. It's how we carry the weight of those who cannot carry themselves anymore. A hush fell over the crowd, thousands gathered in silent reverence. And if one man standing silent in an airport can remind us of that, then maybe, just maybe, we are not so lost after all. The words hung in the air like a benediction. No applause followed. Only a shared, solemn quiet, a chorus of unspoken promises whispered across the earth. Afterward, Hayes walked alone among the graves, pausing now and then to straighten a small flag knocked askew by the breeze. He moved quietly, respectfully. As he had always done. The world had changed, at least a little, but Elijah Hayes remained the same. Not because the world needed heroes in shining armor, but because it needed men and women willing to stand firm. To remember. To carry forward the silent weight of honor without ever needing to be seen. As he walked on, the folded flag cradled gently against his heart, the setting sun dipped low across the horizon, bathing the earth in a warm, golden light. And somewhere, perhaps unseen, the spirits of the fallen walked with him. Silent, proud, and finally at peace. Outside the terminal, the sky had deepened into a velvet dusk, streaked with fiery ribbons of orange and gold. Colonel Elijah Hayes stood beside the casket of Private Samuel Brooks, his gloved hand resting lightly on the flag-draped wood. No crowds now. No flashing phones. Only the hush of reverence. A private military plane stood ready nearby, engines humming low, waiting not just for Hayes, but for the sacred cargo he guarded with every fiber of his being. He adjusted his cap, his spine straight as ever, and offered a silent salute. Not for cameras. Not for recognition. But for the promise made long ago. No one gets left behind. He helped guide the casket up the ramp, each step deliberate, a ritual carved into the very marrow of his soul. As the aircraft door closed, sealing away the fallen and the faithful, Hayes took one last look at the terminal behind him. He remembered. The young woman who dared to live stream the injustice. The Marine who stood firm without hesitation. The passengers who had refused to look away. The strangers who had lent him their voices when he needed them most. In a fractured world too often broken by silence and convenience, they had chosen something different. They had chosen courage. And because of them, because they refused to stay silent. Something changed today. Not only for Elijah Hayes. Not only for Private Samuel Brooks. But for all those who had ever carried invisible burdens through indifferent crowds. Inside the plane, Hayes settled into his seat beside the casket. Not first class. Not luxury. Just dignity. That was all he had ever asked for. The engines roared to life, lifting them into the burning sky, carving a path home. And somewhere deep inside Hayes's chest, amid the aching grief and quiet pride, a simple truth blossomed. Respect does not require grand speeches. It requires presence. It requires a witness. It requires us to see, and to stand. And so, as the plane disappeared into the crimson sunset, a whisper rose behind it. A whisper made of 1,000 grateful hearts. We remember. We honor. We will not be silent. Because when ordinary people choose to stand for what is right, no injustice can withstand the weight of their courage. And that is how change truly begins. If you believe in dignity, in courage, and in honoring those who serve, don't let the story end here. Like, share, and subscribe to keep these stories alive. Because silence has power. But so does your voice. And remember, the world changes, one stand at a time.